My name's Edward Donald. I'm an e-commerce specialist with UKTI. I work in a team in the London office that contains both specialists and also members of the British government civil service, all of whom are in place to help UK brands in the retail industries export. So that is all the sort of categories we have represented here today, plus food and drink, plus all sorts of other categories outside of both in mainstream and niche areas. If you don't know about UKTI, a quick introduction is as follows. There's a headquarters office in London, which in turn supports 350 international trade advisors across the United Kingdom, and they are the sort of tentacles that aim to get into British companies and help them export, and there are a series of products and services that those international trade advisors can offer. And it is such an enormous organisation, I'd really encourage you to sort of dig in a little bit, because we have over 1,300 commercial officers in embassies around the globe, all of whom can help British companies gain market entry, either through traditional routes, namely by helping find distributors and and building license agreements with representation in markets, but increasingly and appropriately on the topic of what I'm going to talk about today, those embassy officers can help build relationships with e-marketplaces abroad. And so UKTI is really one massive networking entity that is primarily here for you. And everyone who works for UKTI is completely agnostic in the sense that what they want to do is get British companies exporting, and in doing so, there may well be other benefits they can offer in terms of helping on manufacturing advice, helping on sourcing advice, so that your margin is improved in the process. But narrowing my introduction down a bit, I'm now going to talk very specifically about the topic of digital commerce today and digital marketing. And the reason I'm just drawing your attention to those two strands is because if you're going into digital commerce, then by its very nature, you also need to be considering how you optimize your digital marketing presence. Put very simply, digital commerce is a worldwide game. You can be seated somewhere in the United Kingdom, and yet you can have the reach of a big global corporate. No longer do you have to have representation in all sorts of different markets and all the staffing and the infrastructure requirements that may involve. You can literally have global ambitions from your living room. Part and parcel of that is then also considering how you optimize your digital marketing presence to support wherever you are seeking to trade. And so that's really what today is about. And having had a quick chat with everybody in the audience today, I'm going to slightly tailor what I'm talking about today to hopefully give you a little bit more depth, because I'm aware that some of you saw yesterday's presentation, so I don't want to repeat it too much. And so please do ask any questions as I go through. So really the first thing I'm going to do is talk a bit about the last 18 months to 24 months. And the key thing is, as I'm sure you're aware, how mobile has impacted not only the way people are searching for product, also how they're buying product, and also the habits which underlie how they are going about searching for products. So cast our minds back a couple of years. People may well have just been searching for product at work on the work laptop, on the work computer, or coming home, putting on their laptop and searching via their, if you like, their static computer. And therefore, the windows of time in their day-to-day lives when they were searching were quite fixed. Nowadays, wind forward to the fact that lots and lots of people have smart devices, let alone slightly older devices. What is happening is people's search patterns are evolving hugely. You now see people reviewing stuff, enjoying stuff on the train, when they're in the traffic jam, unfortunately, and increasingly now with things like Wi-Fi on aeroplanes, that landscape is becoming ever more portable, ever more mobile, and people are searching as they go. And what this is driving is then a lot more purchase online as well. So perhaps an initial thing to begin thinking about is how your presence, in other words, your website and your Facebook page and so on and so forth, how well is it optimized for what is increasingly a mobile audience, both in a physical sense, they're moving around a lot, but also where they're spending most of their time. So with that introduction, I'm just going to talk about some major trends that we can see coming through at a global level through the resources that we have at UKTI, and we support this view using desk research and that type of thing. But the major trend is that ownership and use of mobile devices is on an ever-increasing curve. And that is not only in terms of actual device penetration in mature markets such as the United Kingdom or Germany, but also in markets who are getting smart devices possibly in their first and second generation of market introduction. So regions like Indonesia, for example, or Thailand come to mind. So that what I want to try and paint a picture of is the fact that if it isn't the case in the next year or so, very, very soon, the world is going to be really looking to buy products largely on mobile devices, irrespective of what geography they're in. And I'm just going to underline throughout this talk, I'm going to leave the world of geography behind, and I'm just going to begin talking about marketplaces, because these digital marketplaces are beginning to span multiple countries, and therefore by using them as smaller and medium-sized companies, you can begin to get into regions that you would otherwise not necessarily have had access to before. So where device ownership is growing, and we see continued expansion of things like Wi-Fi and 4G, we get this real growth in consumer behavior, not only in terms of search, but also in terms of spending. And with that come things like peer-to-peer conversations where people are recommending products and websites that they've seen. And because smart device ownership spans so many different generations now, it's no longer possible to say that a smart device is only for early adopters. It's for nearly everybody who's either on a contract or a pay-as-you-go. And I just want to really emphasize how different that makes things for yourselves when you're looking to market and sell products and services. So the result of that is that people are going online first for a whole variety of needs and products and services. And this spans everything from buying things like maybe top-ups on their mobile phones, through to medicines, education, products that they want for their day-to-day lives, gifts, and so on and so forth. So it's becoming a really exciting environment, but it's also quite a crowded environment because people are spending so much time online for so many different things that if you're trying to sell to them, you've got to get into that window in the most appropriate means possible. All that, when all's said and done though, the market is getting bigger as people spend more time online, and their courage in terms of how far they're searching begins to expand. And so we're beginning to hear regularly reports of how consumers in, say, Spain are coming to UK websites, or we have Chinese going on German websites and doing the Google translation and importing products back into China. So what this talks to is a really broad topic which we call cross-border trade. I think for yourselves, hopefully this is a really exciting dynamic because it is possible to really exploit this and do so in a much cheaper way than maybe 2 to 5 years ago because of digital communications, and I'll come on to talk about this in a second. But the other really exciting thing about it is that the fulfillment companies who make this all possible are really in the forefront of driving this, and along with them are all the other sort of services that are required. So pay gates, for example, access to VAT advice, notably if you're trading into Europe, for example, and also call center companies who are understanding that this market is really challenging the way some companies have set themselves up in terms of infrastructure. So what I would really like to emphasize is the fact that this is cross-border trade is a very, very big opportunity, and there are plenty of people which, with UKTI, we can help network you into to optimize how you exploit it. And where this really brings me to is the last point on this slide, which is a really, really significant story, and that is the emergence of e-marketplaces, or as some people talk about them, digital malls, as not only a new sales channel, but they are also a marketing platform. And I'm just going to dwell on this point for a second to explain what I mean by this. In the one sense, they are a new sales channel because they can sit alongside maybe an existing portfolio of retail accounts and an e-commerce operation on your website. And so by opening up on an e-marketplace such as, say, Amazon, or maybe overseas, in Australia, for example, there's a platform called Graze Online, to give you an example. It's possible to complement the existing activity that you have and gain another way of selling goods. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is also to embrace the fact that these platforms bring with them huge numbers of consumers, and they are effectively an audience that you can get in front of for a relatively low go-to-market cost. And so I think it's important to understand that using e-marketplaces have a role both as an omni-channel approach to how you go to market, but also they could be a means of entering a market in a completely new way. So if historically you have looked to find distributors, by all means carry on that route. But equally, please do explore e-marketplaces, because you can get to a bigger audience than probably a traditional distributor can get you to. You can do it at a lower cost, and you can also use these platforms to find out how consumers are searching for your product, even down to sort of what sort of sizes or what colors and that type of thing. So they are a much more sophisticated way of finding where your consumers are than maybe using a traditional approach through a retailer. And I'll come on to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But the overriding consideration here is that they are both a sales and a marketing opportunity. So this slide is more about the future, and I'm going to be quite provocative and just probe a little bit to stimulate, hopefully, your thinking about where your business could go over the next 2 to 5 years and how you will consider targeting your consumers. So here we have a slide that shows a normal pair of glasses, and on it is the same sort of set of icons that you would otherwise get on a smartphone, for example, or on your computer. And the reason why I want to draw your attention to this is that coming through very soon, there will be a whole new category of wearable technology, as it's called, which will consist of watches, glasses, and if you read what Sony have done recently, wigs, or at least some sort of wearable device, and even Google has a contact lens where they're beginning to consider streaming activity. And what this does, I think, is does two things. It begins to blur the lines between what is technology as we understand it today, and therefore, and what it can be in the future. So in other words, technology is integrated into what are, to all intents and purposes, much more day-to-day products. The second thing is, by merging that, you begin to get much greater proximity between what people are using those devices for normally, so glasses for seeing, and then all the advertising that could potentially be streamed over them. So it begins to open up a very, very different world to how consumers could potentially begin behaving, not only with brands, but also how they begin to search for services and products, both in terms of immediate terms here, so maybe where the wear of this glass is indicated to a coffee shop, but also how they may come to view how an early adopter of this product can maybe begin to influence the networks that they're talking to in terms of their Facebook and their Twitter feeds. So I'm just slightly distracted by the music there. So I'm just going to move on to talk about these trends in greater detail. Sorry, is it possible to get that turned? Yeah. So holding that thought around wearable technology and the sort of trends that could follow it, I just want to lay out here on this slide some of the areas to begin to consider as you begin to look at budgets and business planning in the futures. Mobile device growth will continue, and I think this is going to be accelerated by wearable technology. And the key thing here is that wearable technology is likely to be adopted by a very premium-minded consumer, somebody who is not only vocal back to the manufacturers about how well it performs, but also very vocal to their social networks about how they're enjoying the product, what it's enabled them to do, what they've been able to find, and so on and so forth. So if we look at the fact that Google Glass launched deliberately using Diane van Furstenberg's fashion lineup recently, I think we're seeing a very interesting ways in which technology companies are beginning to interface with brands and find new ways to integrate themselves into the mainstream of today's consumer behaviors. So second to this is then the fact that where this new technology is coming, notably in markets like Indonesia and Thailand and so on and so forth, is beginning to really join up the way consumers are behaving. So there'll be more and more search and that type of thing online. This in turn will lead to a bigger online market worldwide. So hopefully for yourselves, that's really encouraging, because if you can get it right, more and more people are searching on this device, and if you can integrate yourself into that sort of land online rather than traditional high street, then you're going to be much more in a position to prosper going forwards. As I mentioned earlier on, cross-border trade is growing and will continue to expand, and there'll be more and more facilities, more and more services coming to market in this space. And I think encouragingly, it isn't just services that can help the big players out there, but there are services that will help people who are offering much smaller products, much smaller shipping quantities into market. And so as that fulfillment market begins to evolve to reflect how cross-border trade is growing and expanding, hopefully for companies like yourselves in home goods, glass, fragile items, paper products, and then your dog houses and that type of thing, you'll find people who can tailor their services much more to you, rather than you having to almost tailor your shipping quantities to the fulfillment companies. And that's definitely a trend that we're beginning to see at UKTI. So the third from last point there around e-market growth, this is a really, really interesting area. There are about 200 e-marketplaces around the globe at the moment. And there are some really well-known ones in Europe, such as Amazon and eBay, for example, but there are some giants out there like Rakuten in Japan, Graze Online in Australia, Mercado Libre in Latin America, and South Korea, for example, has about 15 e-marketplaces. And the point I just want to make here is that two things that look like they're beginning to happen. One is we're getting a sense of regional consolidation, where a really big player in Japan, for example, is now expanding out into Singapore and Malaysia and is beginning to try and grab market share in China. So what that does is open the door to the fact that if you go on a marketplace in Japan, you're also getting awareness in markets like South Korea, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. So you're getting extra value for money from your presence on a platform. What's also happening is that whilst we're getting these regional players, we're also getting niche players. So we're getting platforms that are specifically dedicated to moving food and beverages into China, for example. We're getting specific electronics platforms evolving in places like South Korea and China too. So what they offer brands and retailers is not only, if you like, the volume opportunity, but also a niche opportunity in terms of specialization around a product category. And that's a very exciting dynamic, really, because you can begin to shop around for the right marketplace that could suit your particular needs, either for market entry or to launch a specific product and service and that type of thing. So given this expansion in e-marketplaces and the consolidation that will probably follow from it, more and more, I think it's fair to say that consumers will begin to really understand that as they go on these marketplaces, their data is becoming of huge value to how those marketplaces then offer themselves to the retailers. So the reason I wanted to emphasize the point about your own channels, so your website and that type of thing, is that in future, a lot of the relationship with your product or your brand is going to be via the screen of the device that people are looking through. Yeah, so no longer is it possible, for example, to think in terms of the fact that the relationship is with the branded store or solely with the website. Actually, it's very important that if people call into your company, that they get a really, really good customer service, because that's a direct channel to the consumer. They're coming to you not on face-to-face terms, but at least it's a voice on the end of the phone. And you have a chance there to build a rapport, build reputation, and so on and so forth with somebody coming through that. Simply because the other channels that people are accessing you through are most likely to be through a screen, be it a tablet, be it mobile. Yeah, so I think that's a really big dynamic that's going to be changing things. And we can see it by the appointment of the former CEO at Burberry's to Apple. There's a very simple reason why somebody from a fashion is going across to work in tech. It's the fact that the tech guys really understand that they are increasing the gateway to how consumers are behaving. So just to sort of try and summarize that point after a couple of announcements which trumped me, I think really, really important, if I can make a couple of recommendations, try to really understand the analytics, the data behind who's coming to your website, your YouTube, your Google, and who's opening your newsletters if you're sending them out. So really have a good management view on that direct relationship with your consumers and what they're talking about and that type of thing. And secondly, if you can, think about supporting more activity in those channels that you own, rather than necessarily spending on advertising and that type of thing, simply because there is a growing question over how effective pay-for advertising can be in this changed environment. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about things from the retailer's perspective, from brand's perspective. I think UKTI and government has a tendency overall to talk a lot about the opportunity, but I think we need to hear more about what business is saying to help other businesses progress through and help manage change. So what I've done here is deliberately take two quotes. One is from the Cambridge Satchel Company that I think you will all be familiar with, and the other is Moss Bros, a big men's apparel provider. And one I've entitled The Opportunity, and the other The Need for Change. And what I really want to try and do here is use these quotes to talk about accessibility and access to consumer through the global reach of digital, but also about knowing customers through digital. That's the reason for having the left-hand quote. And then the reason for having the right-hand quote is really to look at things from an operational perspective and begin to use words like mobile, optimizing budgets, and customer journey, and also the need for tracking. So those are the sort of key themes that I'm just going to talk about on this slide. So for context, the Cambridge Satchel Company is in the accessories market, and it's a leather goods that is made in Leicester, but the company is based in HQ, headquartered in Cambridge. And here you have a company that has really embraced digital, not only in the sense of its marketing, but also how it trades. It has an e-commerce website and is very active in trying to serve its product off e-marketplaces around the globe. And the reason for this is twofold. They have found that increasingly consumers are coming to them through digital. So they, for example, use their website to understand where consumers are, and once they're able to pinpoint a bit of where this traffic is coming in, they begin to find an e-marketplace to serve to consumers in that region. And for example, I was on the phone with them yesterday talking about markets like South Korea and Australia, because they know people are coming to them from those regions, and they're now looking for a solution as to how they can get to them. And I'm sure for the likes of yourselves in glass, cards, your petware range and that type of thing, that looking at e-marketplaces and maybe just experimenting with presence on them, you'll begin to find consumers in a way that you might never have done before. So that's really the purpose of having that quote there, which is to encourage you to dip your toe in the water of e-marketplaces and use them as a way of not only finding consumers, but also ascertaining what language they're using when they're searching for products in your category, and then maybe bringing those words back into how you begin to manipulate not only the language you use on your blogs, but also how you may be using things like search engine optimization. So that's a quick very snapshot view of the fact that e-marketplaces give you global reach, digital communications give you access to consumers in a much cheaper way than you've had before. And the point is you can think of this as a very, very flat environment. You can sit in your office and think, could it be Canada, could it be Australia, could it be South Korea, could it be Japan? The point is there's an e-marketplace in each one of these parts of the world, possibly with overlap into other markets, and you can use digital communications to complement that. When we then look at digital communications, this is often quite a tricky subject in companies, because you'll have a website that maybe has existed for a certain amount of time, and then the decision is going to inevitably come, well, what do we do? Do we upgrade it? Do we junk the website and just go for maybe a Facebook page and a Twitter feed, for example? And I think the governing thought that it's important for everyone to get hold of now, when they are beginning to talk about the choice of product images that they use and also the wording that they use in their copy, what needs to happen is that these channels, so websites, social media, digital channels, and things like YouTube, they need to be seen as one entity. So don't split them up in the company and have a budget for one and a budget for another. Bring that budget together and think how you can get the best combined effect of using all those channels. The reason is that it's not so much how the photograph looks, but importantly, it's about the words, the tags that sit behind that photograph. And that applies even more so when you're talking about films on YouTube, for example. So that increasingly you'll hear the term tagging as I go through. And tagging is the term that's used for the words that sit behind a YouTube video or a Vimeo video. And search is being driven more by video views nowadays than just static images. So what I'd like to encourage you to consider, bearing in mind this right-hand quote, is that if the focus at the moment is on static images for your products, then a very simple change that you can begin to implement is now using video content that you tag in a different way, because the pattern of search is being driven by video as opposed to necessarily just static rankings using search engine optimization. This is very exciting. It might be a bit daunting because it's a move away from a nice static product shot, which is nicely controllable. The question is then, how do you construct a really good story to position your product using video? There are companies out there that can advise on this, for sure. But I think what's really exciting about it is not so much the fact that commercially it will take you into a different space in terms of search. Video enables you to tell far more about your product, far more about your story, and you can use multiple videos to tell different aspects about your brands. You can talk about the heritage of your product, the manufacturing process, maybe how your employees interact with the product, their knowledge, so on and so forth. And the reason why this is so important is that the more depth you can provide, the more reassurance that gives consumers when they come into your brand. And anecdotally, I just want to explain a little bit how search is changing for consumers in China, for example. Up until recently, the prevailing view was that consumers were coming in on a big platform like Tmall in China and looking for product and buying it there. This is changing because the number of people who speak English is also increasing, but also people are having more confidence to go outside of the markets in their own geography and search overseas. So what we're beginning to see now is that if an English brand like Clarks, for example, shoes, is on Tmall in China, they're also getting visits onto their UK domain as people seek to understand a bit more about the company, a bit more about their product range, maybe buy something from the UK that isn't available in China. And feeding this interest in your brand and your product line is very important. And honestly, static images on their own can't do it. Yeah? A static image plus 15 lines of text isn't going to be as engaging as a 2-minute film with a nice voiceover and possibly three or four films done for the same budget. So I'd just like to try and steer you in the direction of content and tagging that content appropriately. And the reason why this is the case is that this thought bubble is really where the consumer is nowadays, and increasingly will be in the future. First and foremost, they search whenever they like and whenever they can. So I mentioned earlier on that Wi-Fi now exists in aeroplanes. That sort of dead time when people have to turn their phones off is now made possible as another search opportunity. That's potentially an hour's more searching if you get delayed at the airport than you might otherwise have had. So I just wanted to sort of try and paint a picture of the fact that it's very much more on the consumer's terms now than it was before. And search, enjoyment of films and content is what is behind this big behavioural change. Equally, consumers can buy in any number of ways using a variety of different facilities now. They can buy in the high street for sure, lots of choices. The retailer, the shop-in-shop, maybe the e-commerce website, that's fine, but also now over e-marketplaces. And how people shop in these different channels is driven by so many different things now. It's literally their time, how much time have they got to shop, what suits them best, can it be delivered? And indeed, can it be delivered down to the nearest half an hour, which is the case in China. Yeah, so all these things are beginning to really, really stimulate the way consumers come at products and brands. Where this inevitably takes retailers to is a position of how do I advertise these people who are always on the move and increasingly who will edit out my advertising? How do I communicate to them? And how do I cut through to make sure that they look for me? And I think the thing here is that brands need to stand out. And standing out is not only about the product and the pricing and where you are in terms of the number of channels you're in, but it's also about how consumers are coming into you and how you're engaging them. And this brings me to this word I referenced in the previous slide, which is content. And it's not just content as in films, but it's content in terms of the static images that you produce. It's the voiceover of your call center when somebody comes into you. It's the script of the receptionist when somebody calls the company. All that is outbound communication that is going to somebody who's having an interaction with your brand, an interplay with your brand. And the more human this is, the more relevant it is, and importantly, the more it gives the ability to then travel. So for somebody anecdotally to say, I had a great call with such and such a brand or such and such a service provider, the more it begins to influence their personal networks. And that's a very, very different way of targeting a consumer than paying for an ad, say on the back of an in-flight magazine, and hoping you're going to target people. I need to really, really stress how different this whole dynamic is. And I think it's very exciting, and hopefully it's one that we can help at UKTI help you explore. But the key watch-outs are all about being entertainment-focused, not in the sense of making people laugh, but the point is if you can weave into the communication you give to somebody, not only the answer to what they need, so the product isn't working, you've got to answer that, but if you can give them a little bit of something to take on in terms of a story about your company, they can then move that out into their peer groups, and maybe that brings you trade that you otherwise would not have got. So with that in mind, what I'm going to talk about now is some of the operational considerations that I think it's worth bearing in mind as and when, hopefully, you begin to move into e-marketplaces. And the reason I say hopefully is that e-marketplaces is a major strand of government strategy. We have a new minister, Lord Livingston, who was recently at BT. He believes very strongly in the future for UK retailers being via e-marketplaces. And you'll see more and more support, more and more effort being put into this arena to help yourselves to exploit this. One of the key reasons for this being that e-marketplaces offer brands and retailers a much lower cost of entry into new geographies, new groups of consumers than you might otherwise have had in the past. So I'm going to paint for you for a second a picture of a traditional value chain and then compare it with an e-marketplace. So let's say, for example, in the second but last row we have a premium quality glass manufacturer. It's a fragile product and it needs to be well displayed. So there's a merchandising consideration there, and often in the past you might have sought a distributor in an appropriate market who would then have had a certain network of retailers, and as you took your product to market, your traditional route might have been to go to a trade show, find a distributor, qualify their relevance to your business by checking their retail accounts, and bit by bit taking the product through to the consumer that way. So there are three steps in the value chain. Everyone's got to have their margin, plus which you've got the question of fulfilling that business. I'm now going to turn that on its head and say that the possibility exists to go into a marketplace, so into a massive group of consumers using a digital platform. In doing so, you can open a presence without committing to sell inventory direct. You can just sample what consumers are looking for and build your business direct from the UK by shipping out to consumers in that market. I'll then go even further and say that an e-marketplace in certain countries in the world could actually offer you a very sophisticated entry point, because there are so many of them that you could find a premium e-marketplace versus, say, a more volume-orientated marketplace. So literally, not so much at the switch of a button, but with a series of very, very clear decisions, it's possible to test a market, possible to find out what sort of goods consumers in that geographical region are interested in, and then to ship direct without having to warehouse portside in the other geography, without having to find a distributor with all the costs and risk that that has attached to it. And you can begin to also forecast your business in a different way that then helps with things like inventory planning, materials buying, and so on and so forth. So I think that very simple sort of deconstruction can apply equally to yourselves in terms of pet accessories, gifting in the card sector, and there was a lady earlier on with kitchen products, odor reducers and that type of thing. I really need to emphasize the benefits of going in this way. And there are some major categories that are performing across the globe using e-marketplaces where British brands are very, very, very well equipped to perform. The top 5 major categories in e-marketplaces are sports and outdoor, apparel and footwear, men's and women's, home and garden, electronics and gifting. McKinsey have written at length about this, and the great thing is that because the consumers trust these e-marketplaces, as British brands going onto them, you don't have to build awareness about your presence on the platform, because the platform is bringing lots of audiences to you. What you need to do is begin to shape your product range on that platform to meet the needs of the consumers in that particular geographical market. So I think it's a really, really exciting dynamic that British retailers and brands can benefit from, and clearly at UKTI we're here to help. Now, all things being equal, everything takes time. There are other things that need to be put in place, such as ensuring that the marketing support for your potential new presence is in place and that type of thing. And inevitably, this bubbles up the question, what happens with cash flow? And what I just want to emphasize here is that each e-marketplace behaves very differently. There are about 200 in the globe, and some of them are what are called end-to-end ecosystems, where you advertise your presence through a shop equivalent online, you ship your goods to the platform and they fulfill it for you, and they then pay once the consumer has paid them. So end-to-end, that's about a 7-day payment cycle if the consumer has accepted the goods on the day that they have taken delivery of it. At the other end of the extreme, some of those e-marketplaces offer a 30-day payment term, for example. So depending on how you want to go into these markets, cash flow for small to medium size and medium to large size enterprises will be affected, and it's just important that that is borne in mind for planning purposes. Impacting things at the other end of the scale is their management of inventory, stock levels and returns. And as e-marketplaces offer the ability to turn on a market differently, in some ways faster or with a different tempo at the very least, it's important that management in companies understand the potential impact this can have on inventory and in turn then on buying of materials and stock levels. And needless to say, there will be returns. Certain platforms can help much more with these returns than others. And again, through UKTI, we can begin to help find you the service providers who can help manage this for you if and how, in the best way that's appropriate to your business. But I just want to put out there the fact that these are not insurmountable questions. These are just more prompts about how a management team can look at an e-marketplace and assess its risks against the traditional model that they may be familiar with operating in. So this brings me on to the organizational point, which is that coordination, communication of key decisions are fundamental to operating an e-marketplace, because it's a lot swifter. You get consumers coming in through different ways, and whereas before it might have been the marketing director's desire to go and export, and in some ways that decision might have been separate from, say, the chief financial operator's remit. This is now a set of decisions that come together and need to be looked at by a core operating group. Because depending what pay gate is used to support an e-marketplace presence, something like PayPal or WorldPay, there will be commission decisions there that the CFO needs to be aware of. That may fit with other decisions that need to be planned in as the company expands into other geographical regions. And so it's a really exciting thing, I think, e-marketplaces, because what it can help do is bring decision-making in companies to a very different level, as people have to come together and operate as a core team to take advantage of the major opportunity that e-marketplaces represent. This can be assisted by the fact that the data that's available through these platforms is significant, and that can help optimize budgets. And what I mean by data is that it can help you understand how consumers are looking for products. And anecdotally, we, for example, have been contacted recently by a lingerie company that makes lingerie very specifically for certain sizes. And we have been able to work with certain platforms to get them to produce data to show how consumers are searching for lingerie for different sizes as opposed to mainstream lingerie, for example. And what that helps you do is shape your marketing budgets differently. It helps you shape how you do your search engine optimization differently. And the net gain for that is that you get more from your budgets. Getting more from your budgets is also about holistic planning and execution of your communications. And so, for example, I've worked in small companies and large corporates, and it's still a rule of thumb that often budgets sit differently in different teams. So somebody's looking after digital marketing isn't necessarily looking after the budget for PR, isn't necessarily looking after the budget for simple things like call centers or even packaging. And what I'm suggesting here is that every single contact opportunity with the consumer is a contact that is worth an awful lot of money, and that instead of having separate budgets for all these different elements, what needs to happen is that needs to come together so that packaging design is integral to maybe how the PR budget is considered. And in turn, that is then considered alongside things like search engine optimization and even advertising if you're continuing to buy that type of thing. Yeah, the point is that digital has to drive much greater awareness in companies of where they're committing their money in terms of their marketing and where they can best optimize that spend through all sorts of different parts of the marketing mix. And then on to the last point, and this is about the people in your companies and the knowledge base, the enthusiasm, the stories that they represent. Employees are, I think, one of the greatest strengths that UK companies have, because people shopping for UK brands, they want to understand the heritage, they want to understand the expertise, they want to understand the passion that people have for the products that are made in this country. It's a unique thing that people tend to associate with British companies. So I'd like to encourage you to take the lid off the stories that you've got in your companies, explore content using your employees. If you're machining something, sure, make a video about how the machining of that product is great, but give it a human slant. Find the man or the woman who's worked for 30 years on that jig or something like that, and put them front center stage so they tell the story about the quality of your product, for example. Equally, be aware of how your employees are talking about your brand and your company in their own private social media space, because that's maybe a network of 1,500 individuals that you can begin to feed the reputation of your product through. And so I think people are a tremendously strong asset for a company, and whereas before the question was how to mobilize that resource, that knowledge, I think now, harnessed and moved in the right direction, digital media and content can both be used very powerfully to help you really exploit the marketing mix that's available to you. So now on to some more practical steps to help hopefully those who might be starting off in this space, those who've got a slightly more evolved digital presence, and those who want to really break out and take advantage of e-marketplaces. I really designed this slide to try and cater for the variety of audience and category that I thought I might be meeting here across this week. So the first thing I think is about being found, and on the assumption that you have a website and maybe a number of other digital channels in operation, such as Facebook and YouTube, I think it's really important to get hold of the analytics behind those presences. So on your website, have Google Analytics. If you've got Facebook, begin to mine the data about who's coming in. The same with your YouTube channel. This is by no means exclusive. I just want to make the point about data and using that data to understand how people are coming to find you. Equally, how about setting up something like an Amazon account and talking to the team at Amazon to understand how your brand or your product is being searched for in your category. Those guys want to have you on their platform. They have teams who can run enormous data sets to be able to help identify how consumers are behaving, even where they are. And the other day I was talking to a brand who opened up on Amazon, initially in the UK, then they went the next step and had language pages in Germany and Italy, for example, and then they decided to do the whole thing and open themselves up to all 27 geographical countries within the EU zone. And hey presto, what happened? They found a whole lot of people coming through to them from Poland, and the basket size was 4 times bigger in Poland than in the UK. Now, I'm not here to plug Amazon. What I am here to say is that if you can put yourself onto some of these platforms and begin to understand the analytics that are available through them, it can help you find consumers in other parts of the world that you might not have otherwise been able to access. It'll help you understand how they're looking for your product, who is looking for your product, even for what use, and also what they're saying about it. And if you tie that together with things like your Facebook and that type of thing, hopefully it'll be very, very useful to you. So that's a little bit about getting found and how data can help improve your chances of being found. Once you're found, how do you get in the same consideration set as other brands, other services and products that people may be looking at? And consideration, I think, is key, not only because people are searching more, people are also searching for opinions on products from their peer group, from referrals that people are making. And so this is where content comes into play. Search is being driven by content. People are much more likely to find you if you've got some video content out there than if you haven't. So again, I'm not here to push YouTube per se. You could be on Vimeo, you could be using some of the other video platforms. But the important thing is invest strategically in content. And by that I mean get hold of your budgets, look at what's being deployed against static imagery and your copywriting, for example, put that together with your plans for video content and seek to get the most optimized approach from who's writing your content, who's photographing it, who's filming it. Because brought together like that in a holistic sense, I think you'll get much better value, and indeed you might find that you start changing from having a reliance on static imagery and copy to having much more video with narrative explanation and even sound and that type of thing. It's just much more compelling and will get you in front of far more people because it travels better at the end of the day. People like something, they move it. Now the key thing in all this is don't get carried away commissioning a great film without being really, really rigorous around how it is tagged. And the tagging is going to be increasingly important here as the search engines begin to evolve how they rank and portray content to consumers who are coming in to find it. So be very, very disciplined about the responses that your agencies are giving you in terms of how this is being tagged. But equally, if you're not working with an agency, use a lot of the tools that people like Google provide. Yeah? There's a sort of self-service culture to this kind of thing that they're trying to help you understand. And if you haven't heard of it, there's a product by Google called Hummingbird, which is a look into the future for how content is going to be tagged. So try to familiarize yourself with it And as I say, those suppliers who are producing content for you, be rigorous about what expertise they have in the content tagging area and also what their perspective is of how this will change in the future. I think that's a very, very important sort of strategic area for you. And then the last point is really about improving global reach. So out and out, what I really would like to emphasize is that e-marketplaces are a huge opportunity. And they aren't just in sales channels, but they are fundamentally about building awareness of your product and a new lower cost way into marketplaces. There is enormous appetite for UK brands out in the e-marketplaces. And I will, as I come to the next slide, I'll begin to talk a little bit more about what UKTI is going to be doing in this space. But importantly, when you look at an e-marketplace, please be very conscious of the fact that you are entering a domain where the marketplace itself has its own analytics and its own ways of driving traffic to your site. Yeah, they'll have banners, they'll have inventory that you can buy, they'll have data that you can ask for to understand how consumers are searching for you. Be rigorous about how you interrogate that. But have in mind that you can't just be on there on its own. You also need to consider how you will answer the question of stimulating interest using channels that are off the platform. So what are the digital channels in a given e-marketplace environment that you can use? So if it's China, for example, if it's Tmall that you're considering, or one of the other 15 platforms that is in China, how are you going to have a social media presence off that platform to ensure that you are building a consumer dialogue in a way that reflects the way consumers are behaving. So I just want to deliberately put the point out there that there are on-platform dynamics and behaviors that you need to get hold of, but also really, really get to grips with the social media space and the digital channels that sit alongside but separate from that e-marketplace. Yeah? Because there'll be markets that say, yeah, we can do all your traffic. Yeah? But that isn't the only answer to marketing in that environment. The social media space and the digital space needs also to be considered. And the great thing is, it's possible to do it very, very financially efficiently, and we can help you with that at UKTI. The last point here is around fundamentally return on investment when you're going into e-marketplaces. The basket size, how that is building, and so on and so forth, are key analytics to get hold of. And I mentioned earlier on about the brand that is having a great experience trading in Poland, and they never expected it 3 months ago. That's an apparel brand, for example. Germany is a very, very big market, also for apparel, as I'm sure you're aware. Understand that the whole thing comes together. It's not just your marketing, but your margin, your costs, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't be doing my job unless I asked you to be very rigorous about those aspects. But importantly, the data can help inform those decisions. So I'm just going to finish off by saying that UKTI is gradually going to be doing a lot more in the e-commerce space. I wouldn't be standing here unless that was the case. It's a major drive from George Osborne down through UKTI all the way through into the group that I am part of. And what I want to just finish by saying is that UKTI has 350 international trade advisors across the UK. They are a really, really great team of people with a lot of knowledge in many, many, many sectors of industry, and they are therefore part generalist, part specialist. And if you haven't got an international trade advisor yet, it's really worth getting one, and they can be linked up with you on the stand here. The second thing is, if your default for any question you have is Google, I'd like to just ask that you consider now UKTI, because UKTI not only has trade advisors and experts, but we have access to 1,300 commercial officers throughout the world. And so if it's a question about labeling in Germany for rugs that I got on Christmas Eve, if it's a question about duty into Brazil, we can find somebody to answer that question. I can't guarantee it'll take 24 hours or even a second like Google, but the point is you can access a massive knowledge bank through UKTI. And then lastly, this email address comes direct into the team that I'm in. And what we will do is endeavor to very swiftly, if you come in on this email address, is move you either to somebody in the team, like myself, or to a luxury brand expert, a fashion brand expert, somebody who is in emerging SME category. We will find you somebody who you can talk to answer the specific question you have. And the reason why it's called Digital Accelerator is that over the forthcoming months, you'll see much more activity coming out of UKTI in the e-commerce space. You'll begin to see a selection of products that we are deliberately putting in place to cut down the amount of time that UK SMEs need to take to find some of the answers that they require to export. Equally, you're going to find us putting on events where you'll hear real experts in the field of VAT, real experts in the area of shipping, for example, talking about their specific discipline. And so overall, what we're seeking to do is take the time burden away from companies like yourselves and put in place a means by which you can come into UKTI, go through all the different steps that you require to export, and we will accompany you through that journey. So I'm now going to finish. Thank you for your time this morning. The interruptions hopefully weren't too distracting, and I hope this session has been interesting, and please do continue the dialogue with us in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.